Okay, so we're covering about the middle third of the war after Pearl Harbor, but before the United States and its allies see any significant momentum in the war. This is as bad as it got for the Allies, and it's important for us to realize that during the period from about 1941 to, well, it's, I guess, starting with the beginning of the war on through about 1943 into 1944, it didn't seem like the Allies were going to win the war, and it's important for us to realize that. After Pearl Harbor, Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, basically moved into the White House for about a month, and during these conversations with President Roosevelt, they made a couple key decisions. First of all, they established what they wanted in terms of production schedules and how many planes, tanks, ships, and other things that they thought they were going to need, which sounded absurd at the time, but they actually exceeded those production schedules, or would come to. But the grand strategy that was decided at this meeting was that Germany was the most dangerous, needed the most attention immediately. Germany would be the focus of the war, and Japan they would worry about later. Not to say that Japan wasn't dangerous, they just determined that Germany was more dangerous. To kind of illustrate how bad things were in 1941, 1942 for the Allies, you can see here the extent to which Germany had advanced into the Soviet Union after its June 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union. They never really got beyond this part because stretched supply lines, and they had other stumbles like the cold Russian winter, things like that. So it never really got further than that, but that was far enough for Joseph Stalin's taste. So things weren't looking good in the Soviet Union. They weren't looking good in North Africa, in the Middle East. This guy's name is Erwin Rommel, and he appeared to be within striking distance of the Suez Canal, which would be a major blow for the Allies if the Germans were able to take control of that. They never did. U-boats were patrolling the Atlantic and causing a lot of problems in terms of shipping and transport and those kinds of things as America was becoming more and more involved in the war in Europe. And you can see here on this map the wide net that Japan cast around the Pacific, all the way very nearly to Hawaii in the east, up to the Aleutian Islands off of Alaska in the north, down very nearly to Australia in the south, and almost to India in the west. This is really, again, the furthest extent of their domination, I guess, in the Pacific. And starting with, when we're going to talk about in a minute, the Battle of Midway and the Solomon Islands and the Battle of the Coral Sea in the south, the United States starts to push north and west. But for all those seeming strengths, areas of strength for the Axis, there were some fundamental weaknesses. First of all, Japan and Germany were each fighting two front wars. Now you may be saying, Mr. Becker, the U.S. was also fighting in two front war. That's true. But Japan and Germany also had to worry about defending themselves, especially as the war went on and as the Allies got closer to Japan and Germany itself. They had to endure bombing raids and the threat of invasion or actual invasion, which interrupted its production schedules and prevented them from being as strong as they otherwise would have liked to be. The United States did not have to worry about any of that, and so was able to supply the military necessary to win essentially two wars. Japan and Germany weren't able to do that. The Axis never got together and coordinated their strategies. It wasn't an alliance in the sense that they were willing to sacrifice for each other like the Allies were to a certain extent. You can call them an alliance, but it was really just in name only. And they probably could have used a little bit of help amongst themselves, but they never did that. And the harsh occupations of the conquering countries, especially Japan and Germany, required a lot of resources, required a lot of men and energy and time and money and all those kinds of things. And as the occupations were given the harsh nature of the occupations, resistance movements sprung up, and then they became harder and harder to maintain. So those resources could have been put to, if you think about Germany and having to maintain these harsh occupations, add into that the efforts in the concentration camps, it's not hard to imagine their army being much better off if they didn't have to do those things and use those resources elsewhere. But they had other priorities. I'd like you to go ahead and read this section and take note of those things. You can pause this slide if you need to. But I want you to be aware of those numbers. I'm not going to test you on them, but I want you to be aware of them. And the beginnings of Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt cooperating with each other, I think, is important to note, so please do that. Again, the war in the Pacific was not ignored, and in fact, early American success came in the Pacific as opposed to Europe or North Africa. The first American victory in the Pacific was the Battle of Coral Sea, which is very near Australia in the South Pacific. It is unique in naval warfare in that it's the first naval battle in history in which the two fleets never saw each other. They used airplanes and aircraft carriers primarily. So a good symbol of the changing nature of warfare as technology advances throughout the 20th century. The United States had an advantage over Japan that Japan was not aware of, that the United States was reading their messages and even had been reading their messages prior to Pearl Harbor, even though they didn't read that particular message or those messages. But we knew what they were saying to each other, and we knew that they were going to attack at the island of Midway, which, not coincidentally at all, is located midway between Asia and North America. So we knew they were going to attack that. It's actually also very close to Hawaii. And so we set a trap for them, sunk 3 or 4 of their aircraft carriers, and this is the turning point in the war in the Pacific. And from here on out, the United States is on the attack, is on the advance. The fact that it takes 3 years to get from Midway to the Japanese home island speaks to just how big the Japanese Empire had grown in its expansion efforts throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. But this did change momentum for the Allies, and the first offensives would come shortly thereafter with the Solomon Islands and the Guadalcanal again in the South Pacific. So that's just very briefly how momentum was changed in the Pacific and how the war was generally going in 1942 and 1943.